Hi, everybody. This is Rajam Roos. I'm the CEO and founder of the San Diego Pain Summit, and I am hosting a series of conversations to kind of extend the things that we talk about at this summit, whether it be on stage or, in the audience itself, and to bring it in a way that's easier for you to access in case you can't make it out to San Diego. And today I'm here with Mike Stewart. And he is a physiotherapist and visiting university lecturer with over 20 years experience helping people to overcome pain. He's a dedicated practice-based educator who's passionate about providing evidence-based education to a wide variety of health professionals. He teaches elite sports and is an advisor on pain management to the International Olympic Committee. He has a master's degree in education and is planning a PhD focusing on pain and communication. His published work has received international praise from the leading names in neuroscience. And if you're familiar with the summit, you may know he's come over and taught his No Pain program. He's spoken, I think, twice on stage before, and he's also organized another workshop. So he's been involved a lot in creating summit content. So hello, Mike. Thank you for joining
Hi.
us.
Hello.
And
Thanks for having me.
hope you're doing well over there across the pond.
I am. Yeah, we're doing well with humid thunderstorms. So I'm trying to stay cool. As humid thunderstorms go in the UK, they're not that humid, but yes, I wouldn't be British if I didn't begin by talking about the weather.
Well, and you also wouldn't be Mike Stewart if we didn't begin talking about why you think it's so difficult for people to talk about pain or their pain.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a crucial question, and it's definitely the first time that I came to the summit, which I'm dressed for today. I was asked to speak about this topic, about how can we become a little better at helping people talk about their pain experience, and it's what drives me. You know, it's what gets me out of bed in the morning. It's what sends me to another airport with more jet lag and around the world, because I love listening to people's stories about how they struggle to get people to open up and to talk about their experience and to normalize the uncertainty and the complexity that we deal with. So a lot of my work and drive is to try and help people become better at helping patients talk about their pain. It's really difficult to talk about pain. I think if anybody listening to this thinks about their own personal experiences with pain, we as clinicians are trained to try and give people either a number, 0 to 10, what's it like, or a word. Most of those words were given to us by the McGill Pain Questionnaire. So shooting, stabbing, sharp, throbbing. And usually if you look
Nerve
up and
pain.
yeah.
Is it nerve pain or is it throbbing?
Is it nerve pain? Is it joint pain? Where's it coming from? And of course, you know, we have that moment, don't we, where we get people in pain who will say to us, can you feel it? Feel my arm, feel my neck, my back, my elbow. You know, can you feel my pain? Because they're looking for a connection. There's a disconnect. Elaine Scarry, who's a patient, says that pain is unshareable. To have great pain is to have certainty. If you're in pain, you know you're in pain. But if you're working as a clinician with somebody else, we have doubt. We have a huge amount of doubt that this person is in the amount of pain that they say they are. You know, the classic thing is 0 to 10, how much pain are you in? And they say 9, and we assess their face and make a split second judgment. Well, like, it can't be 9. You know, they've got a smile on their face, or they've got their legs crossed, or
they're still standing.
Yeah. So I think, you know, it's really important to try and acknowledge the problem, that there is this disconnect, that we cannot have their experience. David Biro wrote a wonderful book. He's a doctor who writes about his own personal experience with pain. And he says that pain erects this wall between us and the outside world. So when you're in pain, you're trapped behind this wall. And when you're someone like me who tries to help people with pain, you can't get through it. And that's the same for a loved one. It's the same for, you know, a wife or a kid or a boss at work. So you can't have their experience and they can't have your experience. And we have to begin with that uncomfortable truth. But a lot of my work is about trying to help people develop meaningful chisels. If this brick wall is there, how do we break through it? How do we start to develop empathy? Because empathy is all about making the invisible visible, saying to people, this is real, I know it's real, and providing some empathetic connections. And that's a tricky thing to do. And I think it begins with communication skills, facilitation skills, education skills. These are things that often aren't taught.
Yeah, and speaking of that, so, in your experience, what kinds of changes do you think need to be made in healthcare training, and how, so that clinicians can make it easier for patients to express their pain? I'm sure you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's huge, really. I think that the first thing that I would say, particularly as a physiotherapist, whenever I go around the world training different healthcare professionals, I recognize a problem with physios, particularly, which is as a profession, we're set up to advise people. We provide advice. We say, this is what you need to do. You need to do it this many times, and you need to do. And I think when I did my master's degree, which was in education, it really struck home to me that we talk about this pain education thing. We do it all the time. It's this huge component of what we do. And we throw all of our efforts into learning about pain and pain science, but then we forget the education bit. We forget what do you do when you see people who are confused or they're not grasping a concept, or how much challenge do you offer somebody? How much support do you offer somebody? Judy Foreman, an American health journalist, she spent 4 years interviewing over 200 researchers, clinicians, and most importantly, people living with pain. And she said there's an appalling mismatch between what they need and what we're trained to do. So it's often I see this when I'm working with people. It's not a problem with the individual. If you see something that's been done in practice and you think, oh, that's not great, it's a training issue. I don't think we've really. I go and do some work in different universities around the world, and you see it all the time where we're not developing the guidance skills. How much challenge, how much support. A great example is the word educate comes from a Latin word which means educare. Educare means to draw out that from within. So education begins with drawing things out from somebody, rather than what we often do, which is we pour our knowledge in. We say, let me tell you all about pain. And then we talk there's usually this clinical monologue. And if we look up, we'll see the patient often looking disengaged. E.M. Forster once said that spoon feeding teaches us nothing but the shape of the spoon in the long run.
Yeah, so especially if they've just come from a workshop or a conference and the clinician's really excited. But just something real quick to that. And here in the States, there really isn't a standard of pain education for our patients. However, I have heard from an insider that it has been the American Physical Therapy Association curriculum of standards has now included that in the standard, but it may take a couple years of fine tuning it and everything. So it's actually not yet even in the curriculum here in the States.
No, and it's the same in the UK. Briggs, Carr and Whitaker did a study in 2011, probably needs to be updated with a new version, but they found that less than 1% of all of the curriculum hours across healthcare professions in the UK was spent on pain education. So it's, most of what we do is we spend 99% learning about biomechanics, anatomy, physiology, pathology, and then, of course, it's no surprise when we come out, we don't know how to draw out experiences. We're very good at pouring in our knowledge, our thoughts. We say, I think you need to do this. We did a study, me and a colleague did a study at the University of Brighton. We recorded physiotherapists teaching patients exercises, and we video recorded them. What they didn't realize was we were looking for what percentage of time did we hear the patient's voice. How much of the patient did we hear in these conversations? The average probably won't surprise most people, 12.7%. So it's not a lot. Most of what we heard was the clinician talking with great evidence-based knowledge, but the patient looks disengaged throughout. There's not this opportunity for the patient to explore their experience, to talk about it, to open up.
Yeah, and I think from the perspective of the clinician, knowing that you've lost somebody is also another skill. Like, you have to learn to recognize those micro expressions. And I think a
Yeah.
lot of us don't, we're talking at somebody, and I don't even think we realize that they're not listening unless it looks really obvious, but
No, no, I agree. I often ask people, when I teach people, I say to them, I give everybody a post-it note at the start of the course, and it's to make a wish. So I always say, if you had one wish, what would be the thing that I can try and give you at the end of this course? And you get a whole range of things, and it's often to do with empathy and developing communication and developing teaching skills. But somebody once said to me, I'd love to record my perfect pain education on a dictaphone, and then just say to the patient when they come in, just say, here we go, press the play button, I'll go and get you a drink, I'll be back in 20 minutes. So like a formula. I get it. I really
yeah.
get it. I'm not pointing a finger saying that's ridiculous. I'm pointing a finger saying, I understand, I'm with you, because it's hard. Clinicians are burning out because it's very difficult to do this stuff. And if you're seeing 15 people a day and you're trying to go through it, sometimes it can feel like a treadmill, a dictaphone repetition. And I think if you're in that mode, then we need to start questioning, why are we there and how do we get out of it? Because that's a huge problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because all we're doing is creating formulas and recipes. And if I think back to my initial days as a physio, that idea of a formula or a recipe bored me senseless. I think it's we need to get creative and get playful.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
And in talking about communication about pain, with pain education, and I had this problem when I was as a massage therapist, because I used that with my clients when I was first learning about pain research and implementing it. One of the very first things I struggled with was, for the clients I could tell who were really interested in. I had a lot of clients who were researchers and scientists by trade. And so they were like really interested in this information. But yet their takeaway, even though I never said it, they would come back and say, I know you said this was all in my head, but I really feel like, and I'd be like, oh my
Yeah.
God. And I didn't even say, so what I learned was to start talk about the nervous system. And I just left the brain and mind out
Yeah.
completely. But that seems to be a really big problem. And I see that in Twitter with pain patients who, that's what they're taking from the discussions going on that they're reading with clinicians.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a problem. I think there's a few issues that I see. I think one is empowerment. I think we often talk about empowering somebody, but the big issue for me that I tend to see is, to empower somebody else, you've got to first be prepared to lose power. So as a
Mm-hmm.
clinician, your power goes down, and that can be an uncomfortable thing because we have all this knowledge. And as Steven Pinker quite rightly says, knowledge comes with a curse. Once you understand something, and clinicians really understand it, we sit there, we read the literature, we get into debates on social media. So we live in a world that's very, very different to people in pain. And it's very easy to forget that. And even, we use words like processing, or pain is about processing information, and it's about a perceptual threat. And it's essential, it's crucial to check in with ourselves. I often, one of my strategies I have is, I have my old nan metaphorically perched on my shoulder, and she's
What's
there
a
as
nan?
my
Your
grandmother,
grandma?
my
Grandma.
granny. Yeah, we say nan. It's a northern English thing. But she's there as a checking mechanism. She's there basically saying, stop showing off. Like sometimes your gran would have said to you, stop showing off.
Oh
If
yeah, she puts you in your place.
Yeah, and I think it's important, because I think sometimes we lose the fact that people in pain, they don't understand the science of this. And I think we have to try and provide meaning, because without meaning, they get lost. And that question of, is it all in my head, is one of the classic examples that we need to get better at dealing with.
What are some suggestions you might have if, say the patient really is interested in this information, but they seem to be taking it, that it is all in their head, what do you have any suggestions that somebody listening could maybe utilize or think
Yeah,
about
very
it
much.
approaching differently?
I think that the general theme, there are all sorts of, there's lots of specific examples I can give to people to try tomorrow in practice, maybe. But I think the main theme of the problem is to recognize that if you want to change behavior in somebody, we can't do that with information. Fordyce once said that information alone is like trying to throw spaghetti at a brick. If you just throw spaghetti at a brick, it slides off, it doesn't stick. So if we're just providing information, if we're doing that thing where the patient only talks for 12.7%, they're not recalling that information, it's not changing. So a great example is what I tend to ask people: what do you do when people ask you, is it all in my head? What do you do at that moment? And there isn't a right or a wrong, but I think the issue sometimes is people say, I say to my patient, no, it's not in your head, let me explain. And the word explain is then followed by 10 minutes of talking.
Hmm.
And what you often tend to see is, again, the patient disengaging. They're taking a completely different narrative to what's being said. So there's a disconnect between those two worlds. I think the best piece of advice that I could give people is, rather than saying, let me explain, I would say, this is real. This is real. Let me try and prove it. It's an internal experience. I want to try and find a way to make a shared connection, to try and say, look, I understand that this is real. I want to prove to you that this is real. And then we do that with experience, because experience is what sticks the spaghetti to the brick, not information. So it's an experience. I think often when you say to people, let me prove it, I want to see if I can try and prove it, you get
But
a
not
very
prove it to them, right? Because they already know.
they already
Okay.
know. But
So you're
what I
trying to
want to
prove it that you trying to prove to them that you understand?
that I understand. That's
Okay.
exactly it. Let me prove that I know what you're going through. So it's some sort of, again, that way of chiseling through that impermeable brick wall that exists between their internal experience and our view of this. Because we know the research suggests that people in pain don't feel believed, they feel isolated, they feel disconnected. So it's a way of trying to find a connection, and an experience-based way of learning is a far better approach for that moment than an information-based approach, than
Yeah,
talking. And
because what would be an example of, so, if the pain is the patient's lived experience and nobody can really know but themselves, how am I going to show you that I understand your
yeah,
experience? Is that done with stories or?
you can do it with stories, but again, stories can be helpful because they can enable us to reconfigure and reconceptualize things. But I think an experience, maybe a tactile experience, so a classic sort of relatively easy thing is, we call it the magic thumb trick. So the idea that if you ask somebody to stare at their thumb for a couple of minutes, and they can do it even when they get home, and I tell people, I say, when you go to the bathroom, sit and stare at your thumb for a couple of minutes and just pour all of your attention and focus into your thumb. And I'll give you an example. We had a man who, he worked in a bank. He was somebody who was convinced that his pain was coming from the L45 disc. It was all to do with damage in the tissues. So we asked him to try and do this magic thumb trick, just a way of shifting your cognitive bias, your cognitive attention. And he came back and said, my pain is a shapeshifter, because I can make just by thinking about my thumb, I can make my thumb feel differently. So my body can change based on my thoughts. And this is doing away with what Descartes taught the Western world back in the 16th century. It's trying to connect the mind and the body together. So we get patients who always say, I can feel my thumb. And if I can feel my thumb, then that tells me something, that, that my thoughts do have an impact on this. My perception, my bias, my cognitive view influences how my body feels. One patient said to us, and I love this, she said, that's not a light bulb moment, that's a chandelier moment. So it was this idea of this big realization that comes from realizing that your thoughts do influence your physiology.
Okay, so instead of like giving them the information about blah blah blah, but like spitting it all out to them, come up with an exercise for them to perform to get an
You can
idea of what you're talking about?
Yeah, you can do exercises. We do a whole range of things. A colleague of mine who's a doctor in Spain, he's a doctor, but he's a qualified magician. So he uses magic tricks. And
That
I
sounds
think
like fun.
it's cool. Well, it is. And we have patients who come to our groups, and it's interesting because they often say to us that, this was really helpful. It wasn't a pity party, because quite often their experiences of pain services have been a bit miserable, a bit that we're focusing on problems rather than solutions. Whereas what we tend to do is we have some fun. We have, there's games and experiments. We can use collages and drawings and taste experiments. I often think one of the things that we're looking for with education is you're looking for a whole range of fish hooks. You're looking to try and engage people to say, what if I dangle all sorts of different experiences? And it's important to get across to people that some of these might not work. Some of these might not land. They might
Mhm.
not hit your spot as such. So let's try some different ideas and see where we end up. And it's that creativity that Einstein called it serious playfulness, that idea of playing with things, being playful and not sticking to the formula or the recipe, which
And do
is,
you have a resource that I can share on your bio page maybe? So, like, I know for myself, I'm not I'm creative in some ways, but generally I'm not like what I would call naturally creative personality. So if we're talking about clinicians who maybe feel the same way, is there a resource guide where they could go and get some ideas for
yeah, if they can come to my website, which I have a range of resources. So we've got videos, websites, links to other websites, like for
Okay,
example,
because we'll have that on there. Hmm.
Eugenie Lee. So Eugenie Lee is a colleague over in Sydney, Australia. She's a pain researcher, an artist, and I often show patients art, drawings that she's made. Because I think this is the other thing to consider. Banville in the journal Science once said that art and science are different, but they're alike. They're
Hmm.
alike in their quest to reveal the world. We have phenomena in both science and art, and the job of science and art is to try and discover what's happening, to try and sort of, find out some emerging ideas as to what's happening and why people feel the way they do. And I find that a really interesting thing that we have to consider for our future as clinicians is embrace the science, but start to think about how we can embrace the art and combine the two.
Cool.
Yeah,
Yeah, your website will be on there too. So that
yeah,
that'll be helpful for those of you who are watching who think, "Oh my God, how am I supposed to come up with something like that?"
yeah. Well, I often say to students, it gets Henri Matisse, an artist, he once said, creativity takes courage. So if you're going to try something new, when I teach people, we have lots of fun and we do all sorts of experiments. We bring sweets and we do taste experiments, because if you think about it, if you say, we do this with people in pain in our groups, if you give people a sweet, a Haribo or something, and you say,
What's a
write down
Haribo?
Haribo. Do you know have Haribos in the States? They
We might
like
they might be called something different.
like a little sweet, like gummy bears or candies or
Yeah, we have
something.
we have like hard candies and sorry.
Yeah. We
I was just curious.
I was thinking, I'm sure I've had candies. I'm getting my words mixed up with sweets. But we provide people with an experience, and the experience is to write down 2 words to describe what a taste experience is like. Because as clinicians, we do this all the time. We say, "What's your pain like?" and make it snappy because we've got another patient coming in. So we're
Mhm.
on a time limit, and we give people like 2 seconds to give us 2 words: achy, sharp, shooting, throbbing, and it doesn't do the trick. Then if you ask somebody to draw what that experience might look like, it's a very, very different way of expressing an experience. And as Deborah Padfield once said, these things can provide a slippery slope for further narrative. So you
Mm,
can now have a discussion. If my patient has drawn something like, I saw a guy a while ago who drew a devil inside a box with a
mm.
padlock on top. Those things enable discussions between me and him and his wife. So it's, again, education comes from that drawing out rather than pouring in experiences. And I think it's that shift, which is a really difficult shift and one that we're not trained for.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that using metaphors with patients, or encouraging patients to use metaphors to talk about their pain, falls along the same lines?
Yeah, because metaphors. Scheinborn and Smith argue that metaphors provide people with a safe bridge. So things that are too difficult to talk about literally, people will go for a metaphor. Lakoff and Johnson say that metaphors are they're a fundamental part of human expression. Me and a colleague of mine, Sarah Jane Ryan, have just finished a systematic review. It's just going through peer review at the moment. But we asked the question, do metaphors provide therapeutic value for people in pain? Because there's been this ongoing debate for years, since the 1960s or even earlier, where there's two schools of thought. There's one school of thought who says metaphors are really helpful. We need to use them. It's a way that we express something in another way to make it easier for us. And there's some people who say metaphors in healthcare are terrible. They oversimplify. They're seductively reductionistic. You pull things back so the brain becomes a computer. So nobody had ever really tried to explore this. So we did a review, and we found really it's a very delicate balancing act. There are good things, great things about metaphors. They can provide people with control and expression and connection and being able to get it out. But equally, they can be problematic because you simplify things too much. You can isolate people further. So metaphors are great, but I think one of the big things that I've been finding with the research and the teaching is, as clinicians, we all use metaphors, and people want the metaphor to try and help people make sense of their pain experience. And I often get
metaphor.
Yeah, what's the one thing? What's the magic
the
holy
formula.
grail? Yeah, as the French call it, le baguette magique. Like the magic baguette, the thing that can take it all away. And there isn't, because Bullington once said, I love this: to encounter another human is to encounter another world. So every time you meet somebody new, you have to completely change the way you see things, and you have to be prepared to listen to their world. So yeah, I think with metaphors, we've got to be careful not to use too many of our own, because a lot of the research suggests, and our review that we've recently finished shows that patient-generated metaphors, the metaphors that people in pain themselves use, are really potent. They provide you as a clinician with a window into how somebody's viewing their experience. So they're a great opportunity. A lot of work in psychoanalysis looks at this, enabling people to come to realizations, to conclusions, to behavior change through their own metaphors, through the way that they talk about it.
Letting them come up with the metaphor, and then using their metaphor when you're communicating with them.
Yeah. So, for example, when I teach people, we use a workshop game called the Metaphor Menu, where if you're working together as a partnership, as a clinician and a person in pain, then we have this menu of metaphors, and you have to try and work your way through, how would I use this? How would I get the person in pain to explore this metaphor and tell me more about their experience? One of the crucial things that comes out of the work in psychoanalysis is that humans are terrible at advising themselves. So if my patient says to me, I feel like I'm, at the end of my rope, or I feel like I've fallen down a cliff, that sort of thing, I've hit rock bottom. If they say that, then the worst thing to do is to ignore it, because it's a safe bridge. They've said it for a reason. They've said it because they want to express something that they can't talk about literally. So the most important thing is, I think, to say, I'm really interested in what you just said. Do you mind if we try something? And I think if you're ever going to do something creative, we have to begin with that question. Do you mind if we try something? Don't just walk in and start doing crazy things and, very creative things. Because most clinicians tend to say, well, this is going to be too much of a shock. So I always get across to patients from the get-go, we're going to do some fun, creative things. Some of them you might like, some of them you might not. So I think then if we start to explore their metaphor, we can then enable them to ask them how they would advise their friend. So if your friend said to you that they'd just, fallen off a cliff, that they'd hit rock bottom, what would your advice to your friend be? So by providing a distant advisory scope, you're then able, you're able to help a friend out. You know what your advice would be to your friend. So you're making your own discoveries about your own beliefs and experiences through your own words, which is crucial rather than it being through our words and our advice.
Yeah, just to touch back. Can you hear me okay? My mic
Yeah,
is
yeah, yeah.
just to touch back on what you said that I actually thought was really poetic was every time we meet somebody, it's like we're being introduced to another world. And it just reminds me of this, which I guess is a metaphor. If we can imagine everybody on the planet surrounding the planet Earth in space, holding hands as a big circle, we're each going to see a certain aspect of the globe. And what your neighbor sees and what the people across the way see aren't going to be the same as what we see. And there's nothing we can do to change that. And
Yeah,
so that idea of recognizing that and then letting the patient create their own metaphor and then asking them if they use the metaphor, I feel like I'm at the end of the rope, and then bringing up to them, so if your dear friend told you that they were at the end of the rope, what would be your advice to them? And that sounds really compelling as a way to get them to talk about what their metaphors are and give themselves advice.
yeah. And it just enables people to be able to step outside of themselves and to start to look at it from that distant scope and say, what would I do? Do you know what? One thing that I find really interesting is whenever I teach people these sort of techniques, and we give people opportunities to explore them and to role play. When I teach healthcare professionals, doctors, physios, chiros, osteos, a whole range, I often ask people, I say, at the end of that, how did you find it? 0 is really easy, 5 is really hard. Would you be able to use that with somebody in your practice next week? And the vast majority of clinicians will say 4 or 5. It's hard.
Mhm.
It's really difficult. It's good fun to try it here, but it's really difficult. One thing I found really interesting is whenever I work with non-clinicians, so sometimes I go and teach people who work in insurance companies who are working with people in pain. So these are not qualified healthcare professionals. These people often say it's 1, 2. They find it easy to do this sort of work,
Hmm. Why do you
which,
think that is?
well, this is exactly it. I mean, I've still yet to come to a firm conclusion, but I don't know whether there is one. All I can come to is maybe our training acts as a handbrake. Maybe because we don't see this type of work as physio or healthcare, that maybe we find it more difficult. It sort of prevents us from trying new things.
That
Um,
makes sense. And I wonder if, so we have our training, but then we are also aware of what the patient expects when they come in. So the patient has their expectations of what a physical therapy session probably looks like. And so by us using this, it goes against not only our training, but what we know the
right.
patient is going to expect.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it,
that's
it,
really interesting.
it really surprised me because I went in, my expectation, my viewpoint of the planet was these people who work in insurance, none of them have a healthcare qualification. If physios and doctors find this 4 or 5 really challenging, these people are going to find it like, even harder. And I was amazed, and I've seen it repeatedly with different groups, that when you work in industry and you're working with non-qualified healthcare professionals, it's an easier thing for them to do. And I find that fascinating. And that's the only conclusion I can come to is that our training acts as a handbrake. It sort of stops us from trying new stuff sometimes because we're worried that the patient won't perceive it as physiotherapy or what we do. And in my experience, whenever you talk to people who have lived with pain for a long time and they've been round this sort of roundabout, of trying to find the right solution, they've realized that the traditional techniques that we've been using with people haven't worked. Judy Foreman's right, there's this appalling mismatch. So actually, most clinicians have this sort of concern that people will think this isn't physio. But in reality, a lot of the time, patients say, thank God, something new, something different. And it's interesting as well, because as an educator, one of the things I did in my in my dissertation was to explore the science of interest. What is it that makes something interesting?
Mm.
How do you get the fish hook in the mouth? And two things really come out of that. If something's new and they can comprehend it, so if they have sort of an understanding and it's new, it's different, it's not the same thing that's been done previously, then interest is lurking around the corner. So always ask yourself when you're doing something with somebody, is this new to them? Is it different? Have they heard this all before? And do they make sense of it? Has it got meaning in their world, in their life? And if you've got those two things, then interest is not far behind.
Do you have any suggestions so say if the clinicians hopefully who are listening to this and watching, do you have any suggestions as ways they could practice getting comfortable with this? Would this be maybe role playing with friends and family, or just getting started? And is it
Yeah.
something you'll just have to build up the confidence doing by you repeat doing it, or?
No, I think one of the things in education is to realize that when things are too difficult, we get blocked. Learning blocks are a crucial thing. I mean, as an educator, one of the things you get taught is why do people get blocked? Where do they get blocked, and how do you unblock them? So and these are things that clinicians don't learn about. So we've all seen patients who seem to be blocked. They seem to be stuck in some form of some part of the process. How do you unblock them? So when I see people who I'm training them in using the patient's metaphor, and they find it really hard, the first easy Lego block, the first foundation, is just to listen. Just use your ears. We have two ears and one mouth for a reason. So if we're well, I think it's true. I think the answers to people's problems lie
One
in there.
mouth, it's easier to keep it closed.
Yeah, well, some, not for me. I'm a rambler. If you haven't already experienced that, but I think that yes, if people are given the opportunity to talk, then they will say things. I mean, just listen for your patient's metaphors. That's the first thing to do. The first foundation is use your ears like radars. Listen for your patient's metaphors because they will use them. Any human experience that's difficult to talk about, people will use metaphor. So listen out for them. And then you don't have to do anything. Just make a note of it. And then next week when they come back, you've then maybe had the opportunity to get a colleague and say, could we just practice through this? My patient said this. They said, for example, a lady said to me just a few weeks ago, I feel like my life, I'm a 23-year-old, my life is like I've fallen down this waterfall and I'm in this place that's dark and horrible at the bottom and I keep trying to climb back up. But every time I keep trying to climb back up, I just fall flat on my face again. So rather than saying, okay, what would you do this? What would your advice be to your friend? Just listen to it.
Yeah, because that one's kind of heavy, huh?
Well, it's heavy, but interestingly, though, the solution that she came to was maybe I would advise a friend to walk away from it, to walk away from the waterfall, and by doing so, I might find another path up. I might find somewhere else. And we sit, and this is where drawings come in. I say, well, so how does that look? And where have you been before? And, the one path that she tried before was the osteo and the chiro. And so it's using the person's experience to tailor, to have that idiosyncratic, tailored structure to what you're doing. But the first thing to do is just listen. Listen for the metaphor, write it down. And then if you get the opportunity to practice that with a colleague, how would you advise a friend in this situation? You can then sit and work it out together. Imagine it. How would you feel if you're living with pain and you arrive for the next appointment the following week and your clinician says, you said something to me last week that it really interested me, so much so that I've been really thinking about it since I saw you last. Do you mind if we try something? And then you've had the opportunity to practice prior to doing it on the spot, which is where the improv comes in that we did with Sandy and Alison and Keith at the conference last time. So being able to improvise is hard. So just listen and then think about how you could practice it before they come back.
If I was a patient, which I have been before, and I had gone to see a clinician who had written down the metaphor that I used, and then I came back next week and they said they found it very interesting and repeated it back to me.
Yeah.
that would really make me feel like they were listening to me,
Yeah.
because I may not
Yeah.
even remember I said that. But as
Yeah.
soon as I hear it, I'll be like, "Oh, I did say that." Yeah, that
Exactly.
would make me feel that
You
would
feel
feel
validated.
powerful. Yeah,
And
validated.
you've said it for a reason. You've said it because it was an important thing. I found it really interesting. When I gave my talk, the first time I came to the conference, I left a pad of Post-it notes
You
on
love
the
those
front.
Post-it notes, don't you?
I love the Post-it. I said to everybody in the room, could I get you to come and write down a metaphor that your patient has used that you've heard from somebody living with pain? And I thought, maybe we'll get like 2 or 3 people write something down. I don't really remember, there was a whole wall of
Mhm.
Post-it notes where people had said really interesting things. The one that stuck with me was somebody who'd said to a clinician, I feel like my pain is like living with a backpack, and inside the backpack, there's a heavy metal concert going on.
Oh,
So that
wow.
idea of heavy, loud, really annoying, living with Metallica just constantly on your back. And it's by what I learned from that experience is that people are hearing these things. We just then don't know what to do with those things. And a lot of my work is saying, right, practically, how do you work through this? How do you start to get people to open up? Sometimes people in pain don't use metaphors. I'm sure you'll be able to think about people who they struggle to get it out. They struggle to talk.
Mhm.
Um, so in that case, we need ways to try and draw these out. So collages are a great way, because collages enable, we have a whole range, a portfolio of collages that other people living with pain have created. And we say to people, look, it's not that hard. Here's what people have done. They get together with their kids and with their family, they get a magazine, they stick some images down, and then you can have a conversation. It's that slippery slope for further narrative to discuss it. Equally, we do work where we ask patients, if your pain was a song, which song would it be?
Mm.
So we get people to start thinking about, Joni Mitchell once said that songs are like tattoos, they stick with you.
Mhm.
So I think if you think about, most of us have got a song that links to something in our life, maybe a great time, a holiday, a sad experience, a bereavement. So with people in pain, my experience is if you ask them that question, some will say this is weird. And you go, yeah, but could you think about it? And they think about it and they bring something back, and then you can have a conversation. Some of the work that we did in the improv group with last time I was there in February at San Diego, we did this work with song lyrics that people in pain have chosen. And then we got the colleagues, the clinicians, to work through it. What does it mean? How would you advise your friend in this situation? And then maybe what would the song be afterwards? So we do before and after songs with
Mm.
people. And that's quite an interesting way to look at a change in emotion and behavior, and a change of focus. I quite like that.
No, that sounds really profound. So,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
No.
I was gonna say, um, we're nearing the end of your time, and before I finish up with one last final question,
Mm.
is there anything that we didn't talk about I know, being Mike Stewart, you're an infinite resource of valuable information, but is there anything else that you wanted to talk about?
It never stops. It
Yes.
doesn't. It is great. I'm so happy that I've been in this job now for coming up 25 years, and I'm continually fascinated, and I love that. It's never work for me. I love that, the fact that it's sort of fun and meeting people and listening. One of the things, I suppose, in answer to your question, is one of the big things that I keep hearing from people is they've tried the pain education stuff. They've tried some of this with people in pain, and they really struggle, and they hit a brick wall, and they get that whole question of, are you trying to say it's in my head, or there's a disconnect between what it is they're trying to say and what they think they're saying. And this leads to burnout. It leads to people feeling really shitty at their job, that they're not doing a good job. Sleepless nights. I keep hearing lots of conversations from healthcare professionals who feel really bad about not being good enough. And I think, I know that feeling. I think we need to constantly remind ourselves of how difficult what we do is,
Mhm.
um, and find ways to try and sort of have some solace with that. And for me, one of the things that I heard, I listened to a lot of podcasts, and one of them was an old podcast with Professor Stephen Hawking,
Mm.
the astrophysicist. And he was asked, they said, your father was a doctor. Why did you not follow his footsteps and go into medicine? And he said something really profound that stuck with me. He said, from watching my dad with people, with his patients, I realized that healthcare was too chaotic, too uncertain, too complex. So I decided to go into something simpler. I went into astrophysics. And that really, I was driving the car at the time and I sort of stopped and was like, oh my God, yeah. Well, that's, so let's stop beating ourselves up
Mm.
about not being good enough, because somebody as bright as Stephen Hawking knew this. He knew that it was hard. He knew that there wasn't one way to do what we do. And I think that is a really crucial thing, to remind ourselves of two or three things that went well that day, two or three things that didn't go so well, and to keep focusing on the solution. The problem isn't the problem, the solution is the problem.
Mhm.
So if your focus is on, oh crap, I didn't get that right today, then think about, well, what would be the two or three solutions? What would you advise your friend to do if your friend said this to you? So it's maintaining that focus on the solution, not the problem.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful thought, because I know when I was working, and you always come across cases that are going to trip you up, or you're not going to really understand, or you're going to handle incorrectly. And I think the important thing is to recognize it. It's okay when that situation comes up again, or a similar one, just do it differently.
Yeah.
And I think that can be a helpful way to think and prepare for, if we give a really great quote I read once was, if we give ourselves the space to not be perfect, then when we make a mistake, it won't matter, because we've already given ourselves that room. We're like, okay, well, I'm going to make a mistake, right?
It's
And then when it
exactly.
happens, mhm.
It's crucial. It's crucial. I always see people who come in to see me and they've tried things, they've gained some confidence, they feel liberated to start using their body again. And of course they do a bit too much and they come in and they're in agony and they say, oh God, I've gone back to square one. And I always respond with, great, you did it. What have you learned? What are you going to do differently next time? It's that idea of, even if you stumble, you're still moving forwards.
Mhm.
And that's true for people living with pain, but it's also true for clinicians.
Yeah,
That
and often the patient didn't actually stumble back to square one. If you keep careful notes and they come in and they're like, oh, it's right back where it was, it's never going to get better. And you say, wait
yeah,
a minute, in my notes here, I have that you can still wash the windows. And
yeah,
you couldn't do that at all last time. And then they'll say, oh, okay, so maybe I haven't fallen back, because we forget, our
yeah,
wins.
yeah. It's that classic thing of you don't learn from experience, you learn from reflecting on experience. So we all have experiences, but it's then a question of, okay, well, what did this mean for me? Should I do it the same? Should I do it differently? What can I do that's going to improve things for the future? So it's that constant sort of checking mechanism that I think we need to facilitate. We need to guide people towards that. Dallas, who's an educator, once said that the art of communication, of education, which are synonymous, is knowing whether you're walking ahead, whether you're guiding somebody or whether they're guiding you. And the art is knowing where that line is. Am I the person providing advice, or am I the person shutting up, which is hard for me, and allowing people to come up with their own advice, their own solutions? And it's that dynamic, that shift, I think for lots of healthcare professionals is a tricky one, because we've been led to believe that what we do for a living is us providing advice rather than
Mm.
enabling people to draw out things, which is far more difficult,
Mhm.
but far more fun, I think. I love what I do. It's great.
Well, thank you for sharing your enthusiasm. And this has been just a wealth of information. But I do have one more question.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Go for it.
You're like, I'm ready. So, for the clinicians who are watching, if they're going back to work tomorrow or they're going back to work Monday, what is something that they can do the next day they go back to work that is based on a lot this information that you've shared here, with listening to the client, giving the client the space, learning to use their metaphors, what is something they can start doing tomorrow?
I think the first thing is to gradually gain the confidence in stepping away from the paper and pen approach. As one of my patients called it, the tick boxology approach to healthcare. That idea of come in and we'll just take you through your 20 questions. And that again brings us back to interest. People have had that. They've been there. They've done it. So to have more of a confidence to have a narrative approach, to begin, as Peter O'Sullivan rightly says, start by saying, how can I help? Tell me your story. What's going on? And then gradually develop that ability to then zip it. I'm a talker, so I always begin with, how can I help? And then inside I'm going, shut up, Mike, don't talk. But I'm listening and I'm focusing on trying to see if they can get their pertinent narrative out. So listen more than talk, become more of a receiver of information rather than a transmitter. We often transmit information, but if you can receive it, then you can think about ways that you can guide and facilitate. So it's the listening thing that's the big thing. We often talk about it, and it sounds like a really easy thing to do, but it involves often like 180-degree shift in how we view practice.
Mm-hmm.
And then one other thing is to keep focusing on experience. Information-based learning is it's great, but alone it's not good enough. I mean, I get the pleasure and the opportunity to go and watch different people in practice to provide some feedback. And one of the things we often see is information. It's information-based learning. So shift towards experiences. Think about, how can I help somebody experience this and create meaning from it rather than talk about it. So do rather than talk. I think that's a better way to think about it.
Well, that sounds really great. And we're going to have these resources that Mike mentioned, and also his website will be on his bio, where you can access even more resources about, working with experiences rather than talking. And so thank you so much, Mike, for your time and discussion today. And you have a great weekend.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure. I hope people have gained something from it and that it makes them think, and it's fabulous. So thanks for the opportunity.